You may be seated. Shabbat Shalom, everybody.
Shabbat Shalom.
We are going to meet our Chumash for today's discussion, so keep it handy. Why don't we turn it ahead of time to the beginning of our Haftarah today, which was on page 163. Again, that's 163. This week, I debuted my Torah Talks class on Wednesday mornings. Thank you to everybody who came. We spoke about verses that may not be compatible with everybody's values, and we grappled with them together. Today's Haftarah gives us a similar opportunity. I'm not going to speak for everybody, but there are some verses that give me pause. And I imagine I may be alone in this thinking, but of course, maybe I am. We'll see. The verses in this Haftarah, at least at the beginning, talk about the descendants of Jacob and Issa, the two brothers in today's Torah portion, Toldot. We're going to read the first few verses out loud. So we are on page 163, and we are going to read verses 1 and 2, and let's do 3 as well. Let's read them together. 1, 2, 3. A pronouncement. The word of the Lord to Israel through Malachi. I have shown you love, said the Lord. But you ask, how have you shown us love? After all, declares the Lord, Esau is Jacob's brother. Yet I have accepted Jacob and rejected Esau. I have made his hills a desolation, his territory a home for beasts in the desert. So obviously, or maybe not so obviously, at the point this is talking about the real Jacob and Esau have long passed. We're talking now about their descendants. So by a show of hands, either a thumbs up, a thumbs down, or somewhere in the middle, how do these verses make us feel? Take a moment to think about it. We can read them again to ourselves. I have accepted Jacob and have rejected Esau. I have made his hills a desolation, his territory a home for beasts of the desert. How does that make us feel? Thumbs up, thumbs down, in the middle? I see a question or a comment. Phil.
Down in the back.
All right. Can you elaborate, please?
No, choosing one over the other.
Definitely, choosing one over the other is what it seems like here. And in favoritism. And in the Parsha, we had this exact favoritism. Jacob got the favoritism over Esau. And now they are long dead, and the favoritism apparently is still going on. Wow. Anybody else? Josh?
So, in regards to the favoritism, going a little before this part, like Esau loses his birthright. It's not so much that Jacob didn't take advantage of this, but Esau didn't care, right? Gave up his birthright, arguably in a contract that was null and void. But once it was fulfilled and he had eaten, it's not like he protested this. It was like, yeah, I did it, whatever, who cares? And then he continues to just basically flagrantly disregard the traditions of his father and grandfather. And it does culminate with, in this Parsha, Jacob tricking his father. But I think the way the Haftarah is starting and the way it continues, it's more setting up, it's not so much Jacob and Esau themselves, because they do reconcile, right? as the behavior of Esau and the behavior of Jacob. For Jacob, while he did his father, in all other aspects, maintained the tradition, whereas Esau flagrantly disregarded it until he had already basically lost it. So I think that's really what the narrator is trying to set up here, the dichotomy between Jacob, who got, say, 90% of it right, and Esau, who got like 15% of it right.
Yeah, Josh, that is excellent. Thank you so much. I do want to stress that that is just one way to read it, but I will say that many, many people agree with that interpretation, and for a long time that has been the main interpretation, and it has a lot to offer. And I think the narrator here would agree with Josh, because as we will see in the next verse, it's not just favoritism, it's favoritism for a reason. The people of Israel are characterized one way, and the people of Esau, the Edomites they are called, they are characterized another way. So let's read about that. Let's do verse 4. If Edom thinks, though crushed, we can build the ruins again, said the Lord of hosts. They may build, but I will tear down. And so they shall be known as the region of wickedness, the people damned forever of the Lord. So again, show of hands. Thumbs up, thumbs down, or in the middle. How do we feel about this verse?
I honestly think that.
Certainly we don't have to agree with what God is saying here, and we will get to that soon. Esther, can you elaborate, please?
If people go to a desert region, we're going to build aqueducts and water the fields and vineyards. It's to say, no, you're not. If they're going to put in the work, they should get the reward.
And certainly the people of Israel today are famous for, quote, making the desert bloom. So if Esau's descendants inherited a desert, perhaps, like Josh said, they could have tried a little harder and made it bloom. It's not clear. That's one way to say it. But yeah, Esther, absolutely. It can seem to some of us that God is not saying things in the nicest way. But as I will say towards the end, we don't know if this is God. We know this is Malachi speaking for God. Anybody else? Josh?
I guess we're starting a little bit American. Because I'm going to disagree. I think it's speaking more figuratively, personally, and that based on the context, the ruins they are rebuilding are the edifices of sin, basically. So they're, again, based on the fullness of the narrative and the analogy Malachi makes later, I think that the works of the Edomites in this particular case are implied to be the works of evil. And of course God would tear down the works of evil every.
Interestingly, there is some degree of free will here because the Edomites apparently will keep rebuilding. But apparently it is all inevitable, according to this verse. Yeah, thank you, Josh. Absolutely. So to somebody who doesn't like these verses, and I only have time for one or two answers, I'm afraid, what are some ways that we can reconcile this? Rabbi?
So in Exodus, it talks about visiting the sins of the parents upon the children, which indicates in every generation, people should be cursed and marginalized and whatever. But Ezekiel did away with that concept for all time and said that we don't no longer judge people based on their parents and treat them like their parents deserve to be treated. And from now on, we judge everyone based on their own merits. So I think that if the descendants of Esau showed themselves to be moral people, they don't have to be Jewish, but then we should be treating them with respect and break the cycle of distrust and disrespect.
Yeah, absolutely. We are members of our group, and we are proud of our group, hopefully. But we are not just members of the group. We are also individuals, and each individual is different, and we all have our own merits. So to judge somebody purely because of the group to which they belong is a little short-sighted, probably. Anybody else? All right, in that case, a few weeks ago in Parashat Vayera, Vayera, the Torah gave us the story of the destruction of the city of Sodom. Abraham bargained with God, saying, "Will you spare the city if X number of righteous people live there?" And God agreed. But Abraham drove a hard bargain, and the number of required people, righteous people in the city, kept dwindling with each verse, because Abraham knew the number of people that he was asking for weren't really there. So let's consider the Edomites, whom these verses imply are all wicked, have no righteous people. I personally don't find this very realistic because among all peoples, there will always be some who are good. Labeling any nation as purely evil is wrong, just as labeling all Jews as purely good is wrong. Labeling a nation as too good or too evil is wrong, but there is a distinction between a nation and an ideology. Labeling ideologies as evil, as opposed to nations, I could probably get on board with that in some extreme cases. I want to take a moment to do some storytelling, or rather, for you to do some storytelling. I want you to think about your non-Jewish friends, if you have them, and I want someone to tell the tale of a righteous deed that a non-Jew that you know has done.
Say that again? You want us to what?
I want us to bring up examples of non-Jews that we know that have done righteous deeds. So if you know a non-Jew that has done a righteous deed, I invite you to tell us about it.
Personally, or somebody we know of in the world?
I think we all have the same history books, but I think it's more powerful if we know them personally and can tell that story from first-hand experience. So who knows somebody personally? Okay, if we don't, we can go back to history if we have to. I work at a different synagogue as part of their religious school. And the sad reality of many synagogues these days is that we are not as safe. Oh, Phil, I'll pick on you in a moment. Thank you. We are not as safe in synagogues these days in America as we would like to be. And we have a security guard at this shul, and he is not Jewish. And he is the sweetest, sweetest man. And I love him, and he looks after us. He is kind. He never complains about his job, which is boring, because even though his job is necessary, he doesn't have to do things most days. And when we have services, he comes inside the sanctuary if he's able to for a few minutes at a time. And even though he doesn't know the Hebrew, he prays with us in his way. And I think he is a great example of how a non-Jew can be wonderful, just like one of the descendants of Issa can be wonderful. Yes, Phil?
I was trying to go back in my mind, there's so many. During the pandemic, when I could not go and do anything, I had a non-Jew go and do my shopping for me, not ask, pay for the groceries, make a list, she would do it. Just because she wanted to help me. And she didn't get anything out of it. Well, she may have personally, but didn't get any monetary satisfaction. And
Yeah.
But I have many people who,
Yeah, I think that's a great example, Phil. People who help us out are not always Jewish, and we are indebted to them. Last one, Josh.
So
Oh, I'm sorry, and then Brenda. Josh and then
Brenda
Brenda.
can go.
Oh, thank you, Josh.
Today is with me much more than this. And he is so helpful and so good. And no matter what is happening, it's okay. And he helps here, it's a whole lot. I'm going to move off of what's on the table. That's the table. And that's that. And just that
Hmm,
it's so caring.
absolutely. Thank you, Brenda. There are some who say that we Jews have an obligation to be nice to each other. I'm not so sure that I 100% agree with that statement, but when we have a non-Jew who is nice to us, or when we are nice to a non-Jew, we are showing that our kindness goes beyond the boundaries of religion. And that is a great example. Thank you, Brenda. Quickly, Josh, I'm afraid we don't have much time.
Oh, I just want to quickly say, rather than a specific example, because I don't feel comfortable sharing other people's stories, I will say that in general, most people I have met around the world, and I've been to a fair few countries, are mostly good most of the time. I think rather than even specific examples of when a non-Jew was good, which almost makes it seem like it's a rarity, I'd say, again, most people are mostly good most of the time. As humans, we are wired to feel good when we do good things. It's part of basically every society. So, I say most non-Jews are probably good, fundamentally good people. Most people try to be good because it's good.
I would tend to agree with you. There are plenty of people who are not Jewish who are good. There are plenty of people who are good who don't even believe in God. Absolutely. So I'm going to wrap it up with verse 5. Your eyes shall behold it, and you shall declare, great is the Lord beyond the borders of Israel. And in my opinion, this is the verse that sheds the most light on the verses that came before it. Great is the God, the Lord, beyond the borders of Israel, it says in our book. In the time period depicted in this text, Israel was a land that was often besieged by her enemies, her neighbors. And though the Edomites themselves were not officially an enemy of Israel, they were later associated with the Romans, one of Israel's greatest historical enemies of all time. Today, Israel and her neighbors still quarrel, often violently. In such instances, there is a need to build up the morale of the citizens. Leaders often invoke patriotism at such time, and patriotism can be wonderful. It's great to be proud of your country if you are proud of it for the right reasons. But when it comes at the expense of others, be they other people, other nations, or both, patriotism can stir the pot in a very dangerous way. Yes, pride can be wonderful, but superiority, not so much. At the time this was written, the people of Israel needed inspiration to know that God favored them, but it came at the expense of the Edomites. And I want to compare it to being a sports fan, because I love sports. Before the pandemic, I would often attend basketball games in person. When you are an avid supporter of your team, you would often cheer for them. When you go to the game, it's common for people to boo the opposing team. Well, that doesn't mean that we truly hate the opposing team. I have never heard of home fans booing the opposing team in a game in which their own team came away with a blowout victory. Why? Because there's little point in voicing distaste for the other team if the other team is not truly a threat. When do home fans boo the opposing teams? If the game is close, or if their team is being blown out by the other team, they feel threatened, and that's when we boo. Humans have a tendency to say toxic things when they are threatened. Other times we don't boo, we laugh, and not in a good way. If a team or a player embarrasses themselves, sometimes we laugh at them. If you watched the Lakers in the early 2000s, people would laugh all the time at Shaq when he went to the free throw line. And I'll admit, I laughed too. It was funny. Despite all of his size and all of his strength, he couldn't capitalize on what basketball terminology implies are supposed to be free points. But did he deserve our ridicule? No. He practiced his free throws, and at the end of the day, it just wasn't his strength. He was still a much better basketball player than we ever could be. Sometimes we laugh or poke fun at others in order to make ourselves feel better. We gloss over our own insecurities. And I think that's the case in this Haftarah. The people of Israel felt threatened by its neighbors. But perhaps they didn't feel threatened specifically by the Edomites, who were not official enemies. But it made the Israelites feel better to think that the Edomites had been confined to a quote-unquote wasteland. This is akin to an American today saying, America isn't perfect, but at least we don't live in Mexico. Not only would such a statement be terribly offensive, it's completely dismissive of what another nation and culture has to offer. I realize that I just made a pretty loaded statement about the text, so can I still feel respect for it? And I think I can, so I'm going to get to that now as we finish. When the Bible says something that bothers the masses, commentators often try to find a way to make the text acceptable. Sometimes they do this very well and very skillfully, and other times they do the best they could, but at the end of the day, the mountain is insurmountable. There's no way around it, and we just don't like what the text says. So then we're left with two options. We can ignore it, or we can learn from it. And that's why I love this text. It's so valuable. It teaches us to beware the common pitfalls of humankind. Really, this is another example of the Bible being a document that teaches us how to live well. Sometimes the characters don't always lead by example, and that makes it all the more juicy to read. But make no mistake, it's very much a teaching text, and I still have reverence for it. Did God really tell these words to Malachi, though? Or was Malachi invoking God for the purposes of propaganda? Indeed, I think there might have been a better way to raise the Israelite spirits without doing so at the expense of the Edomites. Perhaps I'm an idealist. I might have had very different thoughts about this if I was living in Israel at the time this text was written. Although I would like to think that's not true. I don't know. We have no way of knowing. The beauty of studying this text together is that we don't actually have to decide one way or the other, though some people might want to. In Judaism, the questions are often more important than the answers, so we just have to think about it together. Thank you for thinking with me this